Welcome back. So we're now on to the third one of the day, getting going. I was going to say good afternoon, Freddie, but I'm of course you're. What? Where are you based? Let's say.
Yeah, let's start at the very beginning, shall we? I am. I'm based in San Francisco, California. It's lovely 4:30 a.m. here, but it's a pleasure to be able to join you guys.
I can't believe George got you up at 4:30 in the morning. I don't know if you're aware of it, but we regularly sack George throughout the season. And to be fair, you give me the early excuse. Well, thank you very much for joining us at this early hour for you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Let's get a little bit about yourself. So I know in your manifesto you've detailed your work experience and stuff like that. But what's your occupation at the moment?
Yeah, so I've again, I appreciate you guys having me. You know, my background, both professionally and personally, has been this nice intersection of sports and media. You know, from a professional standpoint, I began my career at McKinsey, the big consulting firm, where my work was primarily in the sports practice there. I advised many of the big American sports leagues, and within that, primarily the NBA, on a range of different topics, including revenue sharing, but as it relates to probably some of the topics we'll cover here, help them build out their China strategy. So at the time, AEG, which is one of the big stadium operators globally, opened 10 new stadiums in China. And we helped them think about how they launched would launch potentially a new NBA China there and how they would operate these stadiums. From there, I had a stint at a couple of big media companies. First at Bloomberg, where I ran strategy for Bloomberg.com, Bloomberg Mobile. We acquired Businessweek magazine, if people out there are familiar with the publication. I also had a stint at the Weather Channel, which I'm not quite sure there's a comparison over there in the UK. I believe
I've watched it online.
There you go.
It interests me how you can have a station based on weather, but then of course America's a big country, so
exactly. Well, you know, if you could click on some ads next time, I'm sure they would appreciate that too. And you know, I served in a variety of roles there, including chief operating officer at the end of my time there, and then finally I was at most recently a creative artist agency, which for the folks who are listening in who may not be familiar, CAA is a global talent agency that represents the biggest stars in the world. So every famous movie star you can think of, TV star, writer, on and on. There's a part of our business there was as a major sports practice. So at least in all of the major sports here in the US, we represent more athletes than anyone else. And as part of that, we have a practice that does consulting for sports teams and sports leagues, including around sponsorship and the like. While I was there, we actually bought a football agency that represents football players, many of whom came from Latin America, but the agency itself was based in London. And that's sort of how I came across AFC Wimbledon. And, you know, I don't want to take our conversation sideways, but happy to get into that moment as well. But ultimately, my experience has been, again, at this intersection of media and sports. And, you know, because of that, I think hopefully I'll be able to be helpful to weigh in on a few of the things that you guys have been talking about.
Brilliant. So I know you've not had a chance yet to come to Plough Lane, obviously being in the States. What was your first Wimbledon game that you can remember? Obviously, what I'm guessing you're watching online. What was your first Wimbledon game?
Yeah. So someone asked me in the message boards whether I was watching on TV or if I was just sort of following the match recaps. And I have to say, this is sort of maybe season 2.5 of being a fan, you know, in full transparency. You know, if we were to have a trivia contest, I'm sure all 60 plus folks who are watching now would probably do better than me. But I remember many of the, I used to follow through the match recaps, but starting the season, I actually subscribed to iFollow. And so I've been watching the games online. And so as a result of that, my sort of the amount I've dug in with the team has grown over time. And I'd say this season I've, because of that, been able to follow more closely than I have in prior seasons. And so beginning at the start of this year with Northampton Town and flowing all the way through to today.
Cool.
You know,
any players that stand out for you at the moment? Maybe got a current favourite?
Player?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, as you know better than anyone, the team seems to be playing, seems to play worse when they're ahead than when they're behind, or even when the game is tied. So I can appreciate when the team is on the attack. So I've enjoyed watching Joe Pigott.
Good choice. I think a very popular choice at the moment.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go through your manifesto.
Yes.
Interesting. One of the things, obviously, you live in California, and I haven't yet been a player lane. I haven't met many of you. Do you think that's important that you haven't been to a ground in terms of we're looking now at building new fans? So what I mean by that is, you know, we've built a stadium that's a bigger capacity in Wimbledon, back in our community. Do you think that's a problem? How, as a new fan, how do you get engaged with that? Because we have to embrace new rather than old.
It's a great question and a fair question, one that I've gotten a number of times online and one that I totally appreciate, because what I would say up front is, you know, even as a new fan, I can appreciate the role the team plays in the community. I can appreciate sort of the heartbreak of having a team ripped away from you. And I appreciate more than anything fan ownership and the fact that what this team represents to Wimbledon is hugely important. And so the process to vet someone like me who may not be there in person is incredibly important. What I'd say is twofold. One, would I be there in person all the time? Would I go to the stadium? Ideally, of course. But what I would say is twofold. One, you know, I think with the opening of the new stadium, there's both sort of added complexity and added opportunity for how the stadium is operated. And that doesn't necessarily have to, the expertise that I think I can bring to that doesn't necessarily have to be there in person in order to deliver best practices. So for example, when I was at McKinsey working on NBA China, I was not in China. But there are best practices for how, in that case, arenas are operated and how you maximize revenue. And we were able to deliver them really helpful guidance, even as folks based in New York at the time. The second is where I think there's a huge opportunity for the team is around international expansion as well. And of a board composed of many people, having a mix of folks who are in town, in person, there all the time, with folks who may contribute a complementary skill set, whether it be in business or whether it be in a global perspective. I think ultimately that diversity creates a stronger board overall. And so I will be traveling to Plow Lane as soon as possible. In the interim, do I think I can be helpful remote and from a place that's not Wimbledon? Certainly, yes.
Brilliant. So you've answered I was interested by your China strategy, but you explained that. I was pretty interested in that.
Yeah, I'm happy to spend more time on that if there are parts of it that you think.
Yeah, definitely. So China's strategy is, I thought it was, I don't know, but it's obviously China's strategy is in terms of the NBA. How easy was that to move over? That China surely is a
very, yeah. It's difficult. You know, the complexity around China, as I'm sure everybody on the call, you know, either consciously or subconsciously knows, is a very different business operating environment than the UK or the US, because you're dealing not just with having to attract consumers, but you're also having to pitch the government at the same time. And so, you know, we were going through the work. What the NBA had set down the path of doing was both to help operate these arenas, launch a new league, but in order to get the government on board was also building training centers, because the Chinese government, all they cared about at the time was winning gold medals in the Olympics. So again, the complexity of any one of those is difficult, as I know you guys have probably seen firsthand, and the other board members have seen in launching the stadium itself. To have 10 stadiums, then to have to start a league where you're recruiting and signing players, and then while also engaging the government, that had a huge amount of complexity. But for me, on a personal level, as someone who loves sports, couldn't have had more fun digging into those kind of issues.
Brilliant. We've got about 5 minutes left before I hand over to the live viewers. We've got quite a few questions for you. So I was interested, obviously you're in the States, and if you were successful on the Don's Trust board, communication's always been a challenging thing. And you mentioned iFollow previously, which, let's say, we've all had challenges wherever we are in the world.
Yes.
But from your experience as a fan that uses obviously our online capability, if you were successful, are there any areas that you like, or are there areas that you think would make it better for you and in turn, fans remotely?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Obviously, I agree. iFollow leaves a bit to be desired, to put it nicely. Better than nothing, but look, I think what it comes back to, and everybody, I've listened to some of the interviews that you've done so far. A lot of the success, I think, of the club from a business standpoint going forward will be this ability to tell the club's story, right? That story is what will attract new fans. That story is what will attract sponsors. That story is what will attract international expansion. And that story is also what makes the club unique. And so, it's not necessarily what you're asking, but as it relates to fan ownership, I think it's imperative. But, the way in which the site is built and constructed, I think needs to have that story first and foremost, both for existing fans, because it's who the club is, but also for new fans. And so I think there's an ability to expand the number of sponsors, expand the amount of content produced, and tell that story more rigorously within the stadium. I also think this is purely an international perspective that maybe the other folks who are here listening may or may not have an appreciation for, but Wimbledon, the town itself, also carries some cachet even beyond the team itself. And so I think there's a wonderful ability for the club to leverage not just the team story, not just the stadium, but also the town of Wimbledon. And I think the fan-owned nature of the club itself really lends itself well to being able to tell that story globally.
Brilliant. Final couple of questions. Being American, obviously, you're probably not used to relegation. So I noticed when you were talking about watching Wimbledon, you were talking about, I just cheered on the team in the FA Cup in the matches to avoid relegation. Made me chuckle because obviously in America, you have a World League based the American teams.
Yeah.
So is relegation a new thing for you? Is that quite exciting?
I know. I imagine it's exciting until you're actually relegated.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look, trust me, there are teams here who for the second half of every season tank so that they can get a better draft pick because there's no risk to relegation. It makes for some very boring sports for certain teams for certain parts of the year. And I can appreciate the sense of urgency that relegation creates. But to be clear, I'm as excited about promotion as I am about relegation. And so as it relates to sort of being a fan of AFC Wimbledon, I hope that we can move up to the championship and eventually the Premier League.
Good answer. I like that. Finally, are you familiar with tea in America? I don't mean that rudely.
I know. Yes, I'm familiar with tea.
So this is quite important.
Drinker. Yes.
This is quite an important question. Probably the most important question. If you were going to have a cup of tea, would you put your bag in first or would you put milk in first?
Yeah, I would put the bag in first. Put the bag in first, let the water steep, and then add milk as necessary afterwards.
And you don't put it in the microwave, do you? Like there was a viral video.
By the way, if I was to say yes that I put it in the microwave, you should cut off this interview short and ban me from Wimbledon for life. Even I know as an American, you don't throw that kind of stuff in the microwave.
Cool. That's really good. A Wimbledon fan needs to know that. Okay, George, you've got some questions. I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Stu. We've got loads of questions coming in. Firstly, Damien wants to know, what is the reality of your time commitments in terms of being actively engaged in the responsibilities of being on the board, being available for meetings, alongside obviously the time difference and whatever personal and professional responsibilities you have?
Yeah, well, in some ways, George, I appreciate getting scheduled here at 4:30 a.m. in the US because I can very clearly demonstrate that this is a priority for me. I don't mind waking up early. I don't mind staying up late. And I certainly wouldn't have applied unless I was serious about contributing. Like I said up front, I know even right away, and having been a sports fan and having seen teams moved around here in the US, how important the club is to the community and how important it is going forward. And so I don't take running for election lightly, and I wouldn't take my responsibility lightly if I had the pleasure of serving on the board.
Thank you. Hazel Potter wants to know what teams and sports do you follow in the States, and is there anything that we could learn from the way that professional sports are run over there?
Yeah, great question. So here in the Bay Area, well, so the biggest three sports here in the US are American football, basketball, and baseball, and I'm certainly a fan of all three. The 49ers are American football team here. The Golden State Warriors, which some of you may know, you've become good recently, are my basketball team, and the San Francisco Giants are my baseball team. You know, I think the big takeaways are probably twofold, I think, for AFC Wimbledon. One is, you know, I think there's like a pure business standpoint in terms of how these clubs are run. They're very capitalistic and have sort of learned every best practice in terms of how to make money. Some of that will be applicable in the context of AFC Wimbledon. Others, because of the community and fan-owned aspects, should be avoided. But I think just knowing the set of actions that they've taken to be successful from a business standpoint are helpful. The second is the storytelling that these teams do around their players and around their seasons, and how, as a result of that, they engage their fans. You know, the Warriors, for a while, were an underdog story, and now have built sort of personalities around each of their players that have been well publicized. And I think, again, that kind of storytelling will be helpful in this context as well.
Quite often our club is referred to as a movement because of our story, because of our history. Are you comfortable with that description, and what does it mean to you?
Yes, I'm very comfortable with it. I probably would not be a fan of the team unless it was a movement, because otherwise it's sort of like every other team. And so I think keeping that movement is incredibly important. What does it mean to me? You know, I think everybody has been in situations in their lives where they've suffered setbacks or something unfortunate has befallen to them in sports, but in life more generally. And I think when faced with those circumstances, we all like to think that we would sort of keep our feet under us and take action to better our own lot. And to me, when I think about this as a movement and I think about the AFC Wimbledon story, I sort of see that type of self-empowerment. And it's inspirational. You know, I think it's hard not to fall in love with a team when you learn about that story. So I do think it's a movement. And for me, it sort of takes me back to all those moments where I've personally suffered setbacks and sort of rolled up my sleeves and dealt with it myself.
Lee Willett wants to know more about the international expansion sort of ideas that you have. And he wants to know, how do you balance them alongside maintaining the fan ownership model?
Yeah, so it's a great question. You know, I'm sure the club over the years, even already, has sort of managed this give and take between aggressively pursuing business opportunities and other commercial opportunities, and sort of maintaining a more community-focused orientation. You know, for better or worse, and I don't mean to skirt the question, is I don't see necessarily fan ownership as being contrary to pursuing business opportunities globally. And I know there's probably some mindfulness around, okay, well, if we're attracting fans from all over the world, what does it mean to have it owned by the fan? What does it mean to have owned by Wimbledon? And I think those issues can be addressed so that Wimbledon as a community retains ownership and control. But I do think that even under fan ownership, there are some sort of best practices about sponsorship, about media, about stadium operations, about international operations that can be pursued. Internationally, I think it's looking for sponsors who represent the same sort of brand values that the fans would be proud to say that they represent, and having them help you tell their story, because I think any brand would be fortunate to put themselves alongside AFC Wimbledon. It's about having the connections and the energy to go chase them down. You know, I think it's about taking the content that's already produced, but also looking at what flexibility there is to maneuver within iFollow and your own media outlets to deliver live games in a better quality format to fans internationally so that they can watch. Neither of those, for example, they're just extensions of what are already done domestically, and you're just applying those internationally. So I'm very mindful of fan ownership. You know, I may be naive, but I think you can have both at the same time.
Thank you. That's all we got time for.
Excellent. Well, thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Honored to be standing.
Freddy, thank you very much. Thanks for joining us, and go and get some sleep, unless you start your day early.
Appreciate it.
Take care.
Thank you.